New Zealand and Pacific Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to also thank our co-hosts, the Global Health Institute here at Georgetown University, for their support in this event, as well as I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Tara Kabutalaka, and the Center for Pacific Island Studies, who are also supporting this event by providing some of the Zoom connections on the other side of the continent. So thank you all for coming today. We're very pleased that you could join us for today's presentation. It doesn't take a stretch of imagination to note that climate change presents an existential threat to the Pacific Islands. And intensified cyclones, storm surges, and sea level rise all combine to make a real threat to the Pacific. Dr. Eileen Natuzzi is no stranger to the Pacific. She has worked on health capacity building in the Solomon Islands for 18 years. She received her medical degree from George Washington University. We were going over old days back in Washington, D.C. with Eileen. She did her surgical training at the University of California, San Francisco, and obtained her master's degree in public health in epidemiology from San Diego State University. She currently serves as the Solomon Islands coordinator for Australia New Zealand Gastrointestinal International Training Association and is a visiting staff member at the National Referral Hospital in Honiara, Solomon Islands. Eileen is going to present you her lovely talk and I think some interesting images. And will you take questions at the end? Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much. Eileen, over to you. Thank you.
First of all, let me thank you guys very much for having me for this talk. I am a retired trauma surgeon, and I tend to work around in the South Pacific a lot, working with my friends there, and as Alan said, working on health capacity building. In 2014, just to give you some background, I was in Honiara during their significant flood that occurred where people were killed, people were injured, and the hospital itself became a victim. And it was something that sort of stayed with me over the years. I went back and embedded myself with the WHO and did a detailed report on what the health impacts were to the people. And we did an assessment on the vulnerability of the hospital. And so this work kind of, it takes that experience a little further, and I decided I was going to take a look at hospitals in general. In starting, you know, the U.S. now has this fresh new interest in the Pacific Islands that's increased over the past year. And some people refer to that as the Chinese adventurism and U.S. hegemony. And people in the Pacific Islands say that they're concerned that it could destabilize their region. But today, what I want to talk to you about is something that is already destabilizing their region, and that is the effect of extreme weather events on their vulnerable infrastructure. What I'd like to cover with you is the science and health impacts from climate change and extreme weather events in the Pacific region. We'll touch on what country risk vulnerability scoring is and what critical infrastructure is. We're going to start with two examples of hospitals here in the US and what happened to them when they became victims of an extreme weather event. Then move on to the analysis I did on the most vulnerable hospitals in 14 Pacific Island countries. Describe solutions. What's a smart and what's a safe hospital as proposed by the Pan American Health Organization. Discuss why hospitals aren't being prioritized as critical infrastructure, and list difficulties in funding and advocating for safe, smart hospitals throughout the Pacific Islands. So starting with what is an extreme weather event? And we use this term a lot. Number one, it's the most devastating event in the Pacific Island region because it occurs with such regularity. Heavy precipitation, cyclones, tropical storms, storm surge, and high winds are what fall under the category of extreme weather events. And the International Federation of the Red Cross says 83% of natural disasters worldwide are triggered by extreme weather events. So they're not rare. and in the Pacific region, they are quite common. When we look at storm surge, flooding, and heavy precipitation under the umbrella of extreme weather events, the IPCC predicts with high confidence that we're going to see an increase in the frequency and intensity of storm surge and heavy precipitation, in particular in the Western tropical Pacific. And that means when heavy rains come, landslides come, mudslides come, there's destruction of food gardens, in particular in subsistence communities, contamination of drinking water, coastal water, and river runoff. And storm surge can actually add salt to the soil and interfere with agriculture as well as contaminate drinking water. Tropical cyclones, and this is an image of the track that tropical cyclones take in the Pacific region. It is not modern art. These are actually the tracks of the storms between 1980 and 2005. IPCC also predicts that tropical cyclones will increase in intensity in the Western Pacific. So these threats are real threats, and they are potentially increasing. Adding to that, sea level rise, which occurs at 2 to 3 times the rate of the global rate of sea level rise, Pacific islands can potentially disappear. And although earthquakes and tsunamis are not directly climate related, they do impact sea level rise because tectonic plates can sometimes subduct underneath another one, pushing one plate up and sinking another plate. We saw evidence of this in 2007 and following the earthquake in the western portion of Solomon Islands. The island of Rananga went up and the island of Simbo sank by a meter. So I include those as potential threats to infrastructure in the Solomon Islands. Going through health impacts from extreme weather events, many of these I learned firsthand working with the WHO in Honiara following their floods. There are immediate impacts that occur during the actual extreme weather event. And these are usually acute injuries and traumas, drownings, hypothermias, lacerations, fractures, burns or blast wounds, and other blunt force traumas. Those are the people that have to go into the emergency room of that hospital and seek emergency care. Early delayed impacts occur a few days or weeks after the extreme weather event, and they are usually infectious disease related. So we see infectious diseases due to water and food contamination, and most of those present as diarrhea. They're from a number of different organisms. They can be bacterial, they can be virus. And then we see increased vector-borne diseases due to standing water and mosquitoes blooming and spreading dengue and malaria. We also see food insecurity if food gardens are destroyed and supply chains are disrupted during a storm. There are late delayed impacts that occur during the actual response to the emergency and recovery period. And those are usually due to people being displaced from their homes, crowded in evacuation centers, and people with unattended chronic diseases. So we see increases in influenza-like illness. And we really saw this in 2014 following the flood in Honiara. We see exacerbation of endemic diseases, mold, exposure to mold, mental illness, or mental health impacts from the trauma, and chronic disease exacerbation due to lack of treatment, lost medications, or disruption of health services. So when I think about the Pacific Islands, I like to think about what is its risk in general to the Pacific Island countries. And fortunately, the World Risk Report comes out annually, and it ranks countries based on how vulnerable they are to extreme weather events, natural disasters, even war. And since 2011, the top 15 countries that were most at risk for extreme weather events and natural disasters included 5 Pacific Island countries, 5. Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Tonga, PNG, and Fiji. 5 out of 15. The World Risk Report actually defines their vulnerability scale based on exposure. So what extreme weather events or what threats are these countries exposed to? Earthquakes, cyclones, floods, etc. How susceptible is the country itself, depending upon its infrastructure, its food supply, and what is the coping capability of the country, the social aspect of things. How is their healthcare system? How is the social and economic support system? And then the final one is how adaptive is the country to preventing future threats? So all of these factors go into determining which country are most at risk or not. In 2016, the World Risk Report defined the concept that I really have adopted, and that is what is critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is what is needed to survive an extreme weather event. And this list includes a number of different sectors. Number 4 is health. And within health is medical services, which also includes where people get their medical services. So I think of healthcare as being a very important critical infrastructure, because it not only includes the hardscaping of the hospital itself, but it also includes the care that is delivered inside that hospital. So what I'd like to do is kind of just move to these 2 examples of US hospitals that became victims during extreme weather events. And the 2 hospitals are Memorial Hospital in New Orleans and NYU Langone. Memorial Hospital in New Orleans is a 700-bed hospital. It has a population catchment of almost 500,000 people. And in August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5 storm, hit New Orleans. I think most of us remember this story. While the hospital did well initially during the hurricane, it was the secondary event of flooding throughout New Orleans that actually caused the most damage. The lower 2 floors of the hospital, of that 8-story hospital, flooded. When the levees broke, the pumps failed, and the Lake Pontchartrain overflowed. It was 2 bodies of water coming together. The hospital lost power because most of its generators and whatnot were in the lower level of the hospital that was flooded. And unfortunately, without power, they had a significant heat wave, which made it all the more miserable inside the hospital building. Patients were evacuated by boat and by helicopter in a delayed and very slow process, which likely contributed to the unnecessary deaths that we heard about with this tragedy. 11 other New Orleans hospitals, had to evacuate in addition to Charity. And so patients had to be moved a great distance to Texas and the adjacent states to continue their hospital care. Following Katrina, Memorial Hospital was shut down and then eventually purchased and renovated and renamed Oxnard Baptist Medical Center. The cost to renovate this hospital was $100 billion US. And this is what the hospital looks like today. NYU Langone Medical Center, located in New York City, is a 1,300-bed hospital. So it is a behemoth of a hospital. It has a catchment of the greater New York area of 1.6 million people. And it has 18 stories to the building. In October of 2012, storm surge from Hurricane Sandy, which was only a Category 1 storm, resulted in flooding of the lower 2 levels of the hospital. And this is because the waters came in from the East River into Manhattan. The backup generators for the hospital were located on the roof. Smart move. The unfortunate thing is the circuits that distributed the electric were located in the basement. So when the basement flooded, they lost all electricity. And more than 200 patients, including newborns, had to be evacuated using a staircase from the 18-story hospital. Fortunately, if you look at this map on the right, New York City has a ton of hospitals. And patients were evacuated a short distance to another hospital. And this actually prevented loss of life and compromise to care because of the redundancy of these hospitals. So I want you to kind of keep in mind as we look at Pacific Island hospitals, the concept of redundancy of services. The cost to repair NYU Langone, $1.13 billion US. So the lessons I think that I take from reviewing these two hospitals are what and where critical functions for a hospital are located is really important. You know, the circuits in the basement, but the power sources in the roof. Having options as to where patients can be evacuated to, i.e. redundancy, minimizes disruption of care. Renovation and repair of damaged hospitals is expensive. And it's scaled to the size of the hospital and to the location of where the hospital is serving. So let's go ahead and head into the Pacific. Still let this load. And I want to start just with kind of giving you a couple of examples of Pacific Island hospitals, because they tend to be very different than what we think about in the United States. In the United States, we think about Georgetown University's hospital, George Washington, and these are very different hospitals in their construction and where they're located. This hospital is actually pretty close in architecture to what we're familiar with, and this is TTM Hospital in Apia, Samoa. It's in the capital, and it is their largest referral hospital. Most of the buildings for hospitals throughout the Pacific Islands are multiple buildings connected by covered walkways, like this hospital, Tangaroa Central in Tarawa, in Kiribati. And they tend to be relatively light construction. It could be wood, cinder block, corrugated roofs, like this hospital in Vanuatu. And they are almost always situated so that they are easily accessible by the community, like this hospital in Nauru, which actually happens to be the only hospital for the entire country. So in embarking on doing an analysis of how vulnerable hospitals are in the Pacific Islands, I kind of started with asking this question. With frequent extreme weather events, how vulnerable are these remote hospitals located throughout the Pacific? And I asked 3 additional questions. How many hospitals are at risk? What happens when a hospital becomes a victim of an extreme weather event? And how many people are adversely impacted when a hospital is damaged? And to answer those questions, I kind of went through a number of different steps. First, I obtained GPS coordinates of all the hospitals in 14 Pacific Island countries. Fortunately, the Pacific Community Data Hub had this, and the folks at Tupaya, another data source in Australia, donated some of the information to me. I visited each of the hospitals using Google Earth. And using Google Earth, I could actually get a rough calculation of the distance of the hospital from the coastline or river, essentially any hydrological threat. I also calculated the elevation of the hospital above sea level, and then cross-referenced the hospital's bed data information, population catchment with government websites, searched hospital-specific and local news information about hospitals or even just emailed the Ministry of Health folks and said, has your hospital been damaged at all? Has it been repaired? Has it been relocated? And so created kind of a little history story about that hospital. Then I calculated the percentage of hospitals that were located less than 300 meters, which is 1/5 of a mile from a hydrologic threat. And I calculated the percentage of the population that was served by these vulnerable hospitals. So these are the countries, the 14 Pacific Island countries that I was able to get information from, and it totaled up to 76 hospitals. So I spent a lot of time on Google Earth visiting. And this is the first set of data. This is the percentage of hospitals per country that are located within 300 meters or 1/4 of a mile from a coastline or river. And you can see there are certain countries that are at 100%. Some of these countries like Nauru, Tuvalu, that's the only hospital. and their only hospital was located in a highly vulnerable location. And some of these countries have multiple hospitals in multiple locations, like Tokelau, which is predominantly a coral atoll country. This second graph is a graph of the percentage of people within that country who are served by a hospital that's located less than 300 meters from a hydrologic threat. And I find this, when I looked at these numbers, I was kind of a bit shocked. I'll point out that Solomon Islands, which is the country I know the best, is 100% because it is their national referral hospital that delivers all high-level care that is the most vulnerable. And so when I talked to my peers in Solomon Islands, they said, we have to make it, it has to be 100%, because if we lose this, we lose all complicated obstetrics care, surgical care, and whatnot. Overall, 58% of hospitals located in the Pacific Island region are within a quarter of a mile of coastline and river, and 63% of the population is at risk for losing their hospital. This list is a list I put together of what I call my most highly vulnerable hospitals, in particular the hospitals that are in red. And I defined most vulnerable based on location less than 100 meters from a hydrologic threat, so the coastline or river, located less than 10 meters above sea level, and serving a population of greater than 30% of the population. And so we'll visit a couple of these hospitals so I can sort of give you an idea of some of the struggles and solutions that Pacific Island countries have gone through. So all of these hospitals are broken down into three classifications. There are the hospitals that have been relocated due to damage or electively due to their concern about their vulnerability. There are hospitals that are in highly vulnerable locations but have no options to go anywhere. So a narrow atoll, coral atoll, and so they use adaptation, rebuilding, and remodeling. And then hospitals that need to relocate or incorporate adaptation but lack funding to get the job done. We'll start with the first group, and this is the group that either the hospital was damaged or the country made an elective decision to relocate the hospital. This is the location of the original Sakala Hospital in Samoa. It is a 10-bed hospital. It serves a catchment of almost 8,000 people. The hospital is located 23 meters from the coastline. It's on a peninsula that juts out into the Pacific. It's located 11 meters above sea level. And although not damaged by Cyclone Evan that came through in 2012, the government was spooked enough that they said, we need to relocate this hospital. It is in too vulnerable spot. And you can see when you're looking at this image, it's actually kind of a beautiful spot, but highly, highly vulnerable. The decision to relocate was to go inland and up. And so the site for the new hospital you can see is well inland here on this map. It's located at about 1,000 meters from the coastline and at 142 meters above sea level. This is the completed hospital, was finished in 2015. Funding for this hospital came from the World Bank, DFAC, New Zealand Aid, and the EU, and it cost $1.1 million US to build. The original Niue Hospital in Niue, this is the only hospital serving all of the people in Niue. There's a lot of good information to get from looking at the history of this hospital. It was built in the 1990s on another cliffside overlooking the Pacific. And it was destroyed by a cyclone that came through in the 1990s. And it was rebuilt in the exact same spot at a cost of $2 million US. In 2004, it was destroyed again by Cyclone Heta. And for 2 years, while the new hospital was being built in a new location, and the people of Newey got their care in a tent hospital that was donated by New Zealand. The new hospital, the Newey Fu Hospital, is located almost 2,000 meters from the coastline at 61 meters above sea level, so well inland and above. And you can see on this map, the red dot all the way down with the H on it, that's the new location. The blue dot is where the original hospital was. And this is what the new hospital looks like. The second group of hospitals are hospitals that are in highly vulnerable locations, but have no options to relocate. They can't go up, they can't go inland, they have to adapt the way they build. And most of these hospitals are located on atolls and small Pacific islands. The first one is Nukanunu Hospital in Tokelau. And you can see, just looking at this stretch of island, Tokelau is made up of, I believe, 3 separate islands, coral islands. This hospital can't go anywhere. It's known as St. Joseph's Hospital. There were no options for going up or inland. And in 2013, the Ministry of Health and government made a decision to rebuild that hospital and to use adaptation to protect the hospital for the population that it serves. And this is the new hospital. The building in green is the original hospital, the old St. Joseph's Hospital. The 2-story hospital is a concrete frame construction that can stand up to cyclones. There's a large storage tank in the foundation or the ground level. And then due to recurring storm surge that washes across the atoll, the decision to have 2 stories allowed them to keep the valuable medical records and equipment on the 2nd floor. This project was funded by New Zealand Aid. It was part of a joint development project that included a school and was roughly $4.3 million US. The key with this hospital is this is truly a community center for the people that live on this island. And it is where they seek refuge if there's a significant storm. So we have to think about Pacific Island hospitals as sort of kind of being a little different than the way we see our hospitals in the US. Princess Margaret Hospital is in Tuvalu. This is the only hospital serving the entire population of Tuvalu. It's a 50-bed hospital, serves approximately 12,000 people. It is located 30 meters from the coastline at an elevation of 5 meters. And as you can see where the blue dot is, there isn't a whole lot of room to go inland here because of the nature of Tuvalu's island. The hospital has actually been renovated twice by JICA. And the decision was made to protect the hospital by the government from rising sea levels and storm surge as part of a much larger coastal protection adaptation program. Tuvalu's coastal adaptation project, I refer to it as TCAP, was developed in 2007. What the project includes is raised land on the lagoon side, berm top barriers that contain local landfill, reef top barriers, so everything is coming up to block sea level rise, and concrete seawalls. TCAP's price tag is, as you can see, $38.9 million. Most of that, $36 million, is covered by the Green Climate Fund, and $2.9 million of that is covered by Tuvalu. The third classification of hospitals are hospitals that need to relocate and incorporate adaptation in their rebuilding, but they lack funding to do so. And the first hospital in this group is Palau's hospital, only hospital, Palau National Hospital. It's a 75-bed hospital, serves over 11,000 people in Palau, which is the entire population of the nation. It's 15 meters from the coastline. I mean, it's really clear from this photograph that this is nestled in, surrounded almost completely by water. The elevation above sea level is 1 meter. And in In April of 2021, Typhoon Sergei plowed through Palau and damaged not only the hospital, but a lot of the surrounding structures. In 2012, they had a near direct hit from Tropical Storm Rai. And that was a wake-up call where the government said it's time to form a relocation committee and get this hospital in a different location. Here's the big issue with Palau. You can see the little red dot all the way up in the island that's in the upper left-hand side. Most of Palau's islands, multiple islands, are connected by causeways. And the Mayung's Causeway connects to the hospital. These causeways were built during World War II. And so they need a significant amount of upkeep. And if they lose the causeway, Mayung's Causeway going to the hospital, people lose the direct access to the hospital. And so for that reason, the committee is looking at other options. What the Palau government did in 2022, I think is brilliant. They built in the cost of relocating their hospital to their COFA agreement with the United States. And so if that goes through, they have funding to move their hospital or rebuild their hospital so it is less vulnerable. And this is the hospital that I probably know the best, National Referral Hospital. It's in Guadalcanal in Solomon Islands. This is a big hospital. It's the biggest of the vulnerable hospitals in the Pacific, 380 beds. It has a catchment, which is the entire population because it is a tertiary care center of almost 700,000 people. Its job is a dual job. Not only is it a tertiary care hospital, but it's a provincial hospital to the local population of about 160,000 people. So it has a high level access for Solomon Islands. It's located 11 meters from Iron Bottom Sound's coastline, 140 meters from the Tanacao River, and it's a little less than 2 meters above sea level. The hospital is subject to frequent flooding during heavy rains and damage to the frontal buildings from storm surge. The frontal buildings actually turn out to be the pediatric ward and labor and delivery. So those wards are frequently evacuated if there's a significant storm. Following the 2014 floods, a sandbar was built and these the Gabion seawall was built that you can see on the left-hand side. Unfortunately, with this season's heavy rains, that sandbar was washed away. So it's not a permanent solution for this hospital. The real permanent solution is to move it. And so there's been a committee that has been looking at potential locations, and you can see on this map all the way on the bottom in the blue is the proposed site to relocate the hospital to. If this site ends up being the actual relocation, it is over 3,000 meters from the coastline, and it is 117 meters above sea level, a very safe location. But that new proposed location is kind of stuck in a lot of land ownership issues. And in November of 2022, the Minister of Health, Kolvik Kagamana, said it's going to be 10 years before the hospital is built because there's developing plans and then getting into the master plan, construction, land issues, and clearance of unexploded ordnances. This was a war zone during World War II. So in the meantime, the National Referral Hospital, the largest of the vulnerable hospitals in the Pacific, remains a ticking time bomb. It's just a matter of time before something may get it, and hopefully it's moved before that happens. So what can Pacific Island countries do? Pan American Health Organization offers some guidance into what a smart and safe hospital can be. And that guidance starts with just simply identifying, is your hospital vulnerable or not, using their hospital vulnerability or safety index. And we used this in 2014 after the floods. And we assessed National Referral Hospital in Honiara, and it was highly vulnerable, not surprising. The actual guidance for building the hospitals consists of building a safe hospital so that it's structurally and non-structurally functional, no matter what's happening weather-wise. They have a concept of what's called the green hospital, and the green hospital is reducing one's carbon footprint. But if you think about it, in the Pacific Islands where the sun is rich and there's wind, you can have wind energy, you can have solar energy, and there's a lot of efficiency that can be built into hospitals if the right design and guidance and funding is included. And then there's the combination of the smart health facility, which combines a safe hospital and a smart hospital, or an energy efficient hospital. And I think looking at an example of one of these hospitals, these smart, safe hospitals, Peebles Hospital in Tortola, British Virgin Islands, 44-bed hospital, catchment 24,000 people. This hospital is located in what we call Hurricane Alley. They get 10 hurricanes at least a year coming through and nearby. And in 2014, they decided they were going to upgrade this hospital using the smart, safe PAHO guidance because they wanted it to be able to stand up to Category 5 storms. There was a lot of infighting because the budget went way over what was estimated, and they ended up spending $100 million US to renovate and structurally shore up this hospital. But that investment proved to be worth it because in 2017, people stood up to 2 Category 5 storms, Irma and Maria, and they occurred within less than 30 days of each other. So this hospital got hammered. And despite the fact that there was widespread destruction throughout the surrounding neighborhoods, and you can see in the upper left, that's the hospital back there, the hospital sustained only cracked windows. And it was a resource center for people to come to if they lost their homes. So I think that the Peebles is a really great example of, if it's done well and it's done right and you follow some of the PAHO guidance, hospitals can stand up to a lot more than they're standing up to right now in vulnerable locations. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has what they call their Enhancing Healthcare Resilience for a Changing Climate. And I kind of adjusted some of the factors that they thought were important to fit the Pacific Island region. Number one, they need to be designed for tropical climates and the endemic extreme weather threats that Pacific Islands see. They need to be able to warehouse and storm supplies so that you can ride out that severe weather event. So there has to be enough food, water, fuel, etc. They have to have an island operating operation so that they have their own on-site infrastructure. So it doesn't matter what's going on in the community. The infrastructure could be down in the community, but if they have their own energy source, they have their own water and whatnot, the hospitals can continue to provide care for patients and their staff. And then there needs to be a redundancy of services that can be as readily available as possible. So why aren't these hospitals being fixed? What is the issue with vulnerable Pacific Island hospitals? Well, the first thing is governments and stakeholders fail to prioritize renovating and relocating hospitals until they're damaged. And then guess what? It gets more expensive. As you can see from NYU Langone, that was an expensive fix. Hospitals are seen as big ticket luxury items. They are not. They are essential. And in the Pacific Islands, they are part of a community. And so we have to let go of the way we see our own hospitals in the United States or in Australia or New Zealand, and we have to see them through different eyes. They are not big ticket luxury items. They are essential. Hospitals, not recognizing hospitals cross 2 sectors. Not only are they health, but they're also infrastructure, and they're critical infrastructure. Climate change adaptation funding is a problem, and it needs to be redefined, and it needs to be redefined based on risk and not with the heavy weighting that it has right now on gross national index. And then there are land and geotechnical challenges that are unique to Pacific Islands. So things like unexploded ordinances, clearing unexploded ordinances before you can build, and other ecological variables. The bottom line here is vulnerable hospitals have to be seen and recognized in the Pacific region as critical infrastructure. So a little bit of good news is at the tail end of COP27 climate change meeting, loss and damage was agreed to. But the question is it going to fix the adaptation gap so that there's more funding to help countries make them shore themselves up against extreme weather events? Pacific Island countries, by the way, lose about 1 to 9% of their GDP to damage annually. So these are small economies. 9% can have a relatively large impact. The language in COP27, loss and damage, matters. And this is what it says: funds to aid poor countries harmed by impacts from climate change. That needs to be changed. It should say funds to aid the most vulnerable countries harmed by impacts from climate change, because that's really what the justice will be in approaching this. Really important thing that I discovered is the transition committee meeting met for the first time last month in Luxor, Egypt. And there were 24 members of this committee. There wasn't one Pacific Islander on that committee. Wow. So kind of summing things up, for me, this is all about adaptation in the Pacific Island region. This is an adaptation solution. Pacific Island countries, extreme weather event, loss and damage is already locked in. It's already happening. It's going to happen tomorrow. It's going to happen a month from now. It's going to happen a year from now. Locked in. 1 to 9% of their GDP is lost due to damage per year. In 2020, about 20% of global climate funding was for adaptation, and the rest went to mitigation. For Pacific Island countries, emphasis has to be on adaptation because that's what's most needed. And funding to shore up hospitals has to be included. Basically, hospitals need to be seen as critical infrastructure, just as roads, bridges, ports, airports are. Because the only way to keep a country working during a extreme weather event and natural disaster is to have all of those elements together. In Pacific Islands, hospitals serve many purposes. They treat patients during a crisis or not. They serve communities and islands that they're located on, sometimes in really remote locations, atolls and Line Islands. And they serve as refuge sites for patients as well as their families who seek to shelter in them during storms and strife. I hope that this talk has kind of impressed upon you a different way to look at hospitals located throughout the Pacific Islands from the way we see our hospitals here in the United States. And I thank you very much for allowing me to talk, and I'm super happy to take any questions.
Perhaps while the audience is pondering the question, their question, I might lead off. That's okay.
Sure.
You know, I'm curious, Eileen, you've been here in Washington, and I know that you visited Capitol Hill, and you're very passionate about this subject. If you were to think about things that you would want this audience to do, if they wanted to take action, what would you suggest?
You know, I would say, one, do some research on this. You know, don't take my word for this. Go on Google and look up some of these hospitals throughout different Pacific Islands and look at where they're located. But I think the other thing is to talk among yourselves, work on policy, write editorials, meet with some of the people up on Capitol Hill, essentially story with the people that are going to be taking your tax dollars and using them for something, or, you know, NGOs and other, you know, funding sources. But I would say if anyone's interested in doing more in-depth research in this, contact me. I'd be happy to put you together. We have a large group that's working throughout the Pacific now on a more detailed evaluation of the vulnerability of Pacific Island health in general, not just hospitals. I think it's an area that we kind of have a bit of a blind spot for, and I think we need to sort of get that vision back. And so, if you guys are global health, I think it's really important to write letters, meet with the folks up on Capitol Hill, write editorials.
First question, have you already published all of this great work that I love the comparative method you're using?
Yeah, have I published it? It's actually on our website. I put the assessment up on the website. So there is, and there's a bit more, there are more hospitals. I mean, for the talk, I kind of had to scale it down a bit, but there are more examples of hospitals. Yes. And I'm actually presenting this in a more condensed form at the Pacific Heads of Health meeting in Nandi, Fiji, where I'll meet with many of the ministers of health and the folks that are going to decide, are we going to prioritize this or not? So it'll be a very interesting discussion. A lot of stakeholders, development partners will be there. We're kind of hoping we'll be able to, get them a little bit interested in seeing things a little differently.
Jump in. Great talk, very
Thank you.
interesting, very nice survey. And, highlighted some of these, the special challenges the Pacific has. I'm sure that when you go to Nandi, in the room, you're gonna have people who want to spend money on improving services in an existing hospital rather than spending
Yeah.
cash.
Yeah.
To move it.
Yeah.
And that challenge is gonna be a hard one.
Absolutely. And I think that and there are going to be people who are going to say, why do we want to spend money on this when we should be doing prevention? But the problem is, if you don't have that hospital there, you're going to, no matter how perfect your prevention is, you're going to have people that fall through the cracks and are going to need medical care. And if that hospital's not there, it's damaged during a significant extreme weather event, then those services aren't going to happen. We saw this in Honiara after the 2014 flood. People didn't get their diabetes medications. Kids had diarrhea. They had to set up, ancillary hospital, outside the hospital treatment centers. And so, and services that normally would have happened didn't happen. Just as we saw during the pandemic, we had to scale back on certain services. So I think that when we disrupt these acute care settings, and I use that term for hospitals in the US, in the Pacific Islands, it's sort of more like community hospital settings. When those are disrupted, a lot gets lost. And so I think that investing in this hardscaping allows all those activities to be improved and go on inside the hospital. But if you lose that hospital, then you're trying to take care of people in tent cities and whatnot.
My question, again, thank you for a great presentation. It's great to bring our attention to these. I think climate change and health are the key eyeing by many countries towards those countries. My question is, you mentioned JICA building some of the hospitals, rebuilding some hospitals there. Other than JICA, I'm sure that there will be China's doing infrastructure everywhere. And because of the strategic location, the US is increasingly interested and thinking of how to compete with China. Will that benefit these items?
That is exactly why I was up on the Hill yesterday. There's always an opportunity during a threat. There's always the potential of an opportunity. And let's face it, realistically, the US sees China as a threat. I see them as an opportunity. China may rebuild some of these hospitals. There's no question. JICA's done a beautiful job on some of the hospitals throughout the Pacific. Will the US jump into the fray? If they're smart, they will. We will. We will say, we will pitch in through these partners for the Blue Pacific, along with Australia, New Zealand, and rebuild these hospitals.
Are there military presence in there? Would there be, I know the US military has those hospital ships.
Yep.
I know they dock on different islands sometimes, but would it be convincing to say if that's strategically important area that those hospitals can also be of service to some of these military.
Depending upon whether the military were to move into some of the Pacific Islands in a more permanent fashion, yes, but I think right now what we're seeing is the opposite. So if the USS Mercy ship, hospital ship, goes into Honiara, that hospital ship becomes sort of a backup if there were to be a natural disaster. And come November, during the Pacific Games in Solomon Islands, the Mercy is going to be in Iron Bottom Sound, so that when 60,000 additional people show up in Honiara to attend the games, if there's a natural disaster or something that happens, that hospital is the pop-off valve. That hospital ship is the pop-off valve. Flip side of the coin is, in August, the Mercy was in Honiara. And, you know, I follow my friends on Facebook and many of the doctors and nurses and people in a closed Solomon Island group. And comment was made that, you know, they showed a picture of the Mercy ship and they said, floating hospital. And then they showed a picture of the National Referral Hospital and said, sinking hospital. And this is, it creates kind of like that dual system. But, you know, unless military go in, and decide, yes, we're gonna set up a base here, like in Guam, or in, I think it's Tarawa, you know, where we have military bases. Yes, there are really good hospitals. The hospitals are a different caliber than what we see throughout the Pacific Islands. That is what breaks my heart, because that is a difference in overall care that shouldn't happen. That's an inequity. So. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is related to the previous question.
Mhm.
So is there any mechanism for correlation in Pacific Island to maximize their leverage against the big donors from outside, like the US or China, to get as much as funding
Yeah.
for the hospital?
Yeah.
And you mentioned, you explained about if there are dozens of hospitals that need to relocate as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Is there method for making a privatization among Pacific countries?
Mhm.
For example, list the hospitals, the most important hospitals as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is actually what I'm going to be working on in this working group that is being put together by the Secretary of the Pacific Community. There's a group of us. It includes a woman from Fiji, some folks from Australia, United States, and New Zealand. And basically what we will be doing is creating kind of a list, the wish list of hospitals that need the most attention in a few countries to start with, and then moving on to multiple other countries. Look, I think the Pacific is in a perfect position to negotiate with most development partners, in particular Solomon Islands and maybe Kiribati at this point. They can play China off the United States. They can play the United States off of China. And I think to some degree that's happening. That's why the USS Mercy is going back to Honiara, because the Prime Minister said, hey, we'd like to have this hospital here. And the US says, okay, fine. You know, we'll float around out in the water. Could we do that on a bigger level? Absolutely. By creating that database, then that empowers each of those countries to turn around to their development partners and say, hey, we're going to go with this guy over here if you don't help us out with this, you know, important project. So. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about your vulnerability risk score and whether or not it took into account the community networks of these hospitals, especially the way in which most of my experience is in Samoa, but the way it's connected to pharmacies and other clinics that have been opened by physicians and other community health workers that have decided we're going to work outside of the public institution.
Gonna be in
now.
a private setting.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's happening more and more throughout the Pacific. I did not incorporate that. I basically just looked at the hospitals. However, one of my associates, Sabnish Taylor, who's a Fijian woman, she is actually doing more detailed work looking at all of the healthcare infrastructure. So not only clinics, hospitals, and some of the hospitals I looked at were private hospitals, but you know, looking at all of that infrastructure that includes everything, I think is really important. But are Pacific Islands moving into private health? Yes, absolutely. We're seeing it in Solomon Islands. It's been slower, it's been lagging a little bit. Fiji, it's happening on a regular basis. They have a private hospital that is a children's congenital cardiac hospital. And so, yes, we will be building that in to the bigger ball of string, so to speak. And it's a great point, great point. And how will that influence it? That's another thing.
Very much for your presentation. It seems like you mentioned that financing gaps are a big challenge. I was wondering if you've done any research or if there are really any tools out there to look at the cost benefit kind of ratio of investments in different kinds of resilient infrastructure.
Yeah, actually, PAHO does a really good job with their smart, safe hospitals. They have actually done some cost benefit analysis where if a hospital chooses to build itself safe and incorporate some of the green elements, that they actually find that they save money in the long run. But there's the initial investment. It's kind of like, you put solar on your house, you're going to spend money on solar, but on the back end, you end up saving money. So I have not personally done a cost benefit analysis, but if you search PAHO's safe and smart hospitals, you can actually find some data about how much money they save. And you'll probably find People's Hospital as one of the principal examples.
I was curious about capacity and how that's determined. I was noticing that a lot of the examples that you gave, there's something like 50 beds for 12,000 people.
Yeah.
I can imagine that, especially with a lot of extreme weather events, and also increasing likelihood of pandemics and things and other things like that. Are there any concerns about needing to increase capacity?
Yeah, I would say yes. And I would say across the Pacific Islands, they run a very lean healthcare system. Minimal beds. Now, beds can expand. There's the official number of beds. So National Referral Hospital's official number is 380. But that can balloon up to 400, 420, depending upon what's going on, because people end up on the floor between beds, held in the emergency room. So there is some capacity to expand. During disasters, what will frequently happen, and during the pandemic, when the pandemic hit certain islands pretty hard, New Zealand and Australia brought in tents, and people who could be cared for in tents were cared in tents. That's sort of the floating capacity, so to speak. On a daily basis, when I did an analysis of the health impacts after the floods at NRH, we saw the bed occupancy go up, way up, because of injuries, immediate injuries. But then we saw this big bump a week or two later, and that was the infectious disease, diarrheas and things like that, people getting dehydrated. And the response to that was to treat people who could be treated in tents outside the hospital. So that one, you didn't infect other people within the hospital, but two, because they would potentially run out of beds. So capacity of beds is an issue. There's no question.
Along with the hospital, that's just probably part of the healthcare system. What would you give us some idea of its other elements of the healthcare system, such as the physicians, nurses, the labor market, and also medicine? Where do they mostly import?
Yeah, so medications are imported, depending upon the management, usually to a national medical store. Depending upon the management, sometimes medicines run out and services stop until the new medications come. Staffing ratios are a little bit different than what we're used to here in the United States. Nurses, and I would say nurses and physicians, and I speak for Solomon Islands because that's the country, that's the healthcare system I know the best, but there are enough doctors, but most of the doctors are in Honiara, the capital city. And 80% of the population lives out in the provinces. So that's where the doctors should be. The problem is there isn't a mechanism to reward those doctors and nurses to go out and work in the more rural areas. We have the same problem in the United States. And so it's really a distribution problem more than it is a total number of providers. The healthcare system is, I think it's fairly similar throughout most of the Pacific Islands, but in Solomon Islands, there is that tertiary care center, like the National Referral Hospital. Each of the provinces have a provincial hospital, which is smaller, scaled back, can provide some urgent, emergent, and standard care. And then underneath all of those provincial hospitals are area health centers and rural health centers that are usually staffed by nurses. Some of those clinics don't have electricity, and they're accessed by canoe or on foot in more rural areas. So they tend to kind of scope them out into where the people actually live.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a quick question on the idea of redundancy of health services you mentioned. So I'm wondering how that would look like in reality. Do you see like a mix of public, private, and also like primary health infrastructure in the Pacific Island area, and also like in since you mentioned that there are more private facilities like in some countries, do you see that? Do you see the private sector? Are they like do they have sufficient capacity to treat patients, let's say during emergencies? And also like how do you see like, do you think like having that private sector would somehow influence people's access to healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the private sector, what I've seen happening in Solomon Islands has increased some care, but the problem with that is it's people, not everybody can access it. If you have the money to pay for it, you certainly can access it. I think that private has a potential role during a natural disaster. And there is a hospital, one hospital that is actually a church-funded hospital on Guadalcanal called Good Samaritan Hospital. And that hospital picked up a little bit of the slack and kept people out of Honiara getting care in what's called Guadalcanal Plains. So there is definitely a role, I think, for bringing in more private sector. There's a little bit of resistance by people because they feel like, oh, well, that's going to steal away from the national health system. It's going to make it weaker. And yeah, there's real potential, especially if doctors leave and nurses leave the national health system and go into private. I think Australia actually had one of the best solutions to that, and that they said you need to work 75% in the public system and 25% in the private. They kind of partitioned out how much you could work. I think that would be something that they should include. But I think that the private hospitals in some locations can create that redundancy. Now, if you're on an atoll island, coral atoll island, redundancy is really difficult. And that's my point with that is if you don't shore that hospital up so it can stand up to almost anything, there's no redundancy option, because there isn't very much land other than maybe a church or a school that most likely if the hospital's damaged, is damaged as well. So that's where I was kind of thinking about redundancy. It's a great question, though. I mean, all the discussion about private hospitals and what private health can introduce to vulnerability.
Hi, thank you very much for
Sure.
the presentation.
Sure.
I wondered about the role of World Bank and Asian Development Bank
Yeah.
In the region. I know they have resiliency and disaster preparedness
Yeah.
projects, but I recall as a couple of years ago, many of their projects ended up being national government's favorite road building, road
Mhm.
paving.
Yeah.
Large part of their portfolio. So are you able to make some headway in getting this hospital capacity and resilience?
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
as you can see, some of these hospitals that were retrofitted and rebuilt did receive some funding from World Bank and Asia Development Bank. It's not a whole lot. I would say that the lion's share of that money is coming from DFAT and New Zealand Aid and JICA. There's virtually nothing coming from the US. But I know that the Asia Development Bank assisted Solomon Islands in doing an analysis of what were the best locations to move the National Referral Hospital to, how should it be rebuilt, what's the estimated cost going to be, and then it kind of fell off a cliff. And I don't fully understand why that, probably because there wasn't enough government interest in funding it or development partner interest in funding it. And Asian Development Bank didn't put their hand in their pocket and say, we're gonna, help out with this. I think that the banks have been slow because again, I think they see these hospitals as luxury items. And I think that, my hope is that philosophy will change. I think they see them once they're destroyed as something, yeah, we should probably pitch some money in to help them build this hospital. But there's plenty of hospitals that need to be relocated, before they're damaged.
I'm surprised I didn't hear Australia there. What is the Australia's?
Oh, I'm sorry, DFAT is Australia.
Okay,
Yeah, that's their term for that's their USAID like equivalent. And New Zealand refers to it as, I think it's NFAT and NZAT. So yeah, sorry, and JICA.
Yeah, I know China.
Yeah, you just mentioned some of the ETB's kind of disaster risk analytic work. I was wondering what you mentioned that the projects have kind of fallen apart. Is that in your assessment due to like lack of government capacity or interest? How do you think that those could be better leveraged?
I'm going to give my opinion and then I'm going to ask my friend Charity to say, because she's a Solomon Islander, and say what she thinks it is. But I would say that I think it was the government not putting enough emphasis on funding the hospital. And so it didn't go anywhere. That's my understanding of it. Charity?
You're correct. I think you've done a great job analyzing what's going on in the city. And dealing with the government itself, that's a problem lies with leadership. So, we can bring all we can and show them. And like you said, sometimes the government lack of supporting. So that's where the other place that we're gonna work around how, to champion that for them to realize the importance of healthcare. I mean, in Honduras itself, Solomon Islands, but I think you laid down wonderfully.
Thank you.
So thank you.
One little side story that I was really impressed with. When I was in Honiara in November, they just had this massive flood and had to close off parts of the hospital, turn off the power so nobody was electrocuted. And the doctors and the nurses were mopping the floors. And one of the doctors turned to the other one and said, if they put a roof on the new Pacific Games Stadium that was built, we could move the hospital over there. And that summed up the fact that the government put priority on a two-sided stadium for the Pacific Games over shoring up their healthcare system. And there are many people, just in Solomon Islands alone, and I think it happens throughout Pacific Islands, they see that, they recognize that, they speak out against that, but somehow it doesn't seem to face the government. We have that in the United States too, but.
Sorry, I don't want to take too much of your time or anybody else's time.
That's okay.
So thank you very much. My question was, is there existing relationships between Pacific Island countries themselves that can increase the idea of redundancy? Like, is there relationships that can be, or are there already relationships that can be built upon in order to benefit off of their, proximity in,
Yeah, I think there are, and I think that people in Pacific Islands are very generous towards each other. And so if, like when Vanuatu was slammed with two cyclones in close temporal period, people in Solomon Islands, people in Fiji were raising money to send help there. From a hospital, just a hospital redundancy standpoint, take a look at a map and some of these islands are so far apart. I remember the first time I actually traveled to Solomon Islands, I was teaching at Fiji School of Medicine. And I said to my mother, I'm going to go over to Solomon Islands because I'm going to be in the neighborhood. Hundreds of miles away, 3-hour flight. It's not in the neighborhood. It's a big area. It is the blue continent. So I think that creating kind of emergency response teams from one country that goes to another. Similar to the Ramsey forces that went in and helped out in Solomon Islands when they were having some political trouble, is a really great plan. And there's some talk about doing that, in particular with like EMT services and stuff like that. So creating response teams, emergency medical response teams is a good thing to do. But the distance, I think, between so many of these hospitals is almost unmanageable unless you've got, a hospital ship or a boat that can, commandeer, or a series of boats that can commandeer around to the different islands. I would say that New Zealand and Australia are almost always at the forefront in responding to any natural disaster throughout the Pacific. They really are. And I'm an annoying thorn in the side of the US government, because if there's a natural disaster, in particular in Solomon Islands, I am on the phone, I am emailing, I am saying, let's get US resources there. But Australia and New Zealand, they fly into almost any country. And I think that creating that within the Pacific Islands is a really easy thing to do. I think it's an additional resource that could be built into the whole vulnerability adaptation response. And so it's a great point that you bring up.
Just build on it for a second. The Chinese government has announced plans to forward position supplies with massive natural disasters. And you can imagine forward positioning equipment that might be the 10th hospital, for instance, which you could forward position. Also creates an opportunity for collaboration.
Yeah. I wish there was a bit more collaboration between all of the development partners, because that is beneficial for the people in the Pacific Islands. We shouldn't be flying on flags. We should really, because that's inefficient and redundant. And yeah, I think strategically placing supplies where you can mobilize them easily, absolutely. It's kind of like our national stockpile. Yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me thanking Eileen Natuzzi for her excellent presentation. Eileen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Anyone interested in working on this? Just contact me. Alan knows how to reach me.
And good luck on your trip. And you can leave what, 2 days?
Yeah, fly back to California tomorrow and then